Good afternoon, guys. Welcome to this Babylon workshop. It's a real workshop in the sense that we're going to work with a couple of really new ideas. And I think the ideas resonate with a lot of what we do here in our own research and what we all believe to be important for the next step in the new program. The new ideas are really new in the sense, that there's only just a little handful of things that appeared as working papers for the moment on citizen sociolinguistics. It was an idea that I myself basically bumped into a few weeks ago when I was at GERT at Washington, D.C. And I listened to a presentation by Rob and a number of other fellows from University of Pennsylvania, GSC. It was absolutely riveting, absolutely amazing material and a great possibility for us as well, I think, to tag our own work onto it. So what's going to happen is Rob will introduce the thing. He has a lecture prepared. It's going to be also very visual in the sense that we will be looking at materials about Irish, notably about Irish, I think. Yeah. After which I will, in a way, respond with something, a little idea that emerged from listening to their work. And then, of course, it's open for all, and I think it's going to be quite stimulating. Now, purely technically, I'm going to wire Rob so that he can be heard on the tape, which I hope we shall broadcast on YouTube. So you'll be very famous.
Great. Thank you, Jan, and thanks everybody for coming. Basically, here we go. Boom. I'm going to do two things. I've developed just a very brief kind of introduction to this notion of citizen sociolinguistics, which is the creation of my colleague at Penn GSE, Betsy Rimes. She coined the phrase, and she sort of has been taking a leading role in kind of developing this as an approach to looking at sociolinguistic, looking at the dynamics of sociolinguistic variation, broadly understood, using online materials. So, and it turns out that she's given a seminar on this a couple of times at Penn, and it turns out that I did some work on I'll be talking about it in a minute, but I did some work on online representations of Irish accents in YouTube and in other online forums, and published a couple of articles about it that became that unbeknownst to me became key texts in the citizen sociolinguistics thing. So anyway, it's all a little bit complicated, and what you will see now are actually some slides that Betsy Rimes prepared, and I'll identify them, and then you'll see some slides that I prepared. Okay, so first I'll introduce citizen sociolinguistics, and then I'll take you into a specific kind of study that I did on Irish accent culture and schizoglossia, which will be explained, believe me. Okay, so here's a slide of Betsy's, kind of putting the citizen sociolinguistics approach into the context of so-called citizen science. And this is not a homogeneous, citizen science is not a homogeneous field. There are lots of differences in some, tracking the migratory patterns of the monarch butterfly involved numerous ordinary people registering to uploading to a website their sightings of the monarch butterfly, which is a migratory species in America and flies to Mexico for its reproductive cycle. And there was a period when people thought the monarch was rapidly becoming extinct because the kind of nesting place in Mexico changed. But thanks to the efforts of citizen observers, they found where they were going, and the monarchs still exist. So their citizens are performing kind of basic labor. They're really providing raw data to a project whose framework is completely defined by scientists. So sort of feeding sort of little facts into a machine designed by scientists. There are also, Betsy has discovered an online forum for people who have problems with opossums or possums. You may know this animal, a small marsupial pest. that roots around in people's gardens. And so there's apparently this robust online fact-sharing, tip-sharing phenomenon online where people exchange helpful hints on how to rid yourself of possums. Okay, another Betsy Rhymes slide. Why citizen sociolinguistics? Well, first of all, there's, as you know, a vast amount of material on the internet relating to various aspects of language in which people deliver themselves of various kinds of opinions about language, and also, of course, present samples of the linguistic facts they're talking about. The epistemological reasons have to do with sort of crowdsourcing multiple ordinary people's, what we used to call folk linguistic perspectives on sociolinguistic phenomena. Okay, social science 2.0 involves crowdsourcing multiple perspectives. Participatory culture is a kind of a buzzword in that world, and so the idea is that forms of knowledge can be developed collaboratively by a whole large number of individual contributors. Here are some kind of methods, resources online. You know all these: YouTube, Reddit, Google, autofill. So when you type in my accent into a Google search, it will present a whole series of suggested completions like, is terrible, how do I change it? Or things like that. So you can learn something from that. And then, of course, meta-commentary is also richly in evidence in all of these online sources. Now, this is me. My take on how citizen sociolinguistics to me is not like a brand name, and it's not a paradigm, and it's not really a unique approach, but is actually, I think, simply a way of drawing on online sources to develop our approach to sociolinguistic, to language and society, to further it in the direction it's already heading. I think the directions it's already heading, having been mapped out for us very importantly by Jan Blomart and others, many in this room. So, citizens' online reports about and representations of sociolinguistic data. These are kind of things I think I'm trying to make explicit, things I have been taking for granted, just to set a kind of framework. So these data are never unmediated. They're always biased, and that is exactly what makes them valuable. They're not valuable because they're phonetically accurate reports. They're valuable because the presentations are always embedded in a textual context in which various language ideological positions are being staked out. So we're studying language ideologies now. We're not studying language attitudes, right? There's a whole approach in research on language attitudes that views language attitudes as residing between the ears of individuals and as stable psychological orientations to languages. And the methods that are used to study language attitudes are always methods derived from experimental psychology, in which you conceal in which your informants are experimental subjects, and you conceal from them the goals, intellectual aspirations, assumptions of the study, and you use them kind of, you present them with what experimental psychologists call task demands. right? Which is what a maze is for a rat. And you see, in the framework of experimental psychology, of course, it's absolutely essential to control the context in which observations are made and making your task demands identical, right? You can't give a different maze to each rat, right? You have to give the same one, and you have to give the same kind of elicitation protocol to every participant in a language attitude study. That's not what we're doing. And I had to put naturalistic in quotes because I'm emphasizing the mediated quality of this material. So we're doing kind of quasi-ethnographic and textual analysis of online materials. We're not doing experimental protocols like matched guise tests. Speakers and interlocutors, I think, in citizen sociolinguistics and in the newer forms of sociolinguistics generally are viewed as authors and text creators, not experimental subjects. Okay, so that's number one. And I mean, my own material that I'll get to in a second from Ireland, I will try to make a stronger argument that not only are, online reports about and representations of accent data always mediated, I think people's actual non-online, in-person, face-to-face speech practices are, of course, also mediated. So there's no, what we're giving up is, we're giving up the idea that at some point we're going to get to a layer of unmediated, raw, natural data. A consciousness of speakers is, as the postmodernists like to say, somewhat irritatingly, always, already saturated, ideologically saturated, so language ideologies aren't just ideas, beliefs people have in their heads. They're social forces that shape both the interpretation of someone else's speech and one's own production of speech. So, So, 2, online data provide a rich trove of data on language standardization viewed from below. This is me sort of modifying the inherited from my colleague Betsy framework of citizen sociolinguistics, because most of the places that we've started to look at this kind of material are all coming from societies with a sociolinguistic regime organized around standardization. I mean, of course, with sociolinguistic regimes that are complex and polycentric, but the introduction of a standard language provides a certain kind of anchoring point for both ordinary people's understandings of the meaning of language variation, and I would argue traditional sociolinguistics of the Lebovian sort also takes the standard as the point of reference. So in that sense, Lebovian variationist sociolinguistics is itself embedded in and implicated in a language ideological regime that, for lack of a better word, we can call standardization. So we're studying shibboleths, a word that I love, that I recommend everyone use. Shibboleths and also look up the original reference in the Bible, which you may know, right? Okay, I hate to but I mean briefly, and I won't do it justice by quoting it verbatim from the King James Version, which is what Baptists like myself were raised on. But it's a battle scene between two of the tribes of Israel, the Gileadites and the Ephraimites, I believe. So a battle scene, and some of the Gileadites who have survived the battle, and this is important, some of the Gileadites who've survived the battle steal clothing off the dead bodies of Ephraimites and attempt to escape the battlefield dressed as the enemy that has just vanquished them, and they attempt to pass as members of the other group, and they come to a river crossing, and there's an Ephraimite guard there who says, "Are you a Gileadite?" No, I'm one of you guys. And then the guard says, okay, prove it. How do you say shibboleth, which is Hebrew for bank of a river? And they said sibboleth, because they could not frame to pronounce it right. And on that basis, 20,000 were killed. So it's all about mobility and boundary crossing. Shibboleths, and shibboleths are with us. I mean, that's not just ancient history. In Northern Ireland, in Northern Ireland, Catholics and Protestants speak exactly the same way. You can't really tell by the way they don't have different accents, despite all the other. They eat the same food, they wear the same clothes, they have the same range of accents, but the 8th letter of the alphabet in English is pronounced H by Catholics and H by Protestants. And there was a vocational school in Belfast that was invaded by Protestant paramilitaries during the Troubles, and they put the students up against the wall and pulled guns on them and had them recite the alphabet. So anyway, shibboleths and registered forms of standard and non-standard speech with emblematic value. Emblematic, like sibboleth, shibboleth, emblematizes your identity. What I try to do with dealing with online materials is identify things like the voicing strategies taken up by online commenters. And these come in a lot of different flavors, but one thing I've seen a lot of are sort of didactic displays of expertise, like, that's not the correct way to say that, or the real Dublin accent is, or the Philadelphia accent actually doesn't sound like that. They are, dealing in terms of the Philadelphia accent as if there were one. So didactic displays of expertise. There's just vituperation, of course, all over the internet, especially targeted at the character presented, say, in a clip. We'll see an example in a minute. And also to think about the technological affordances of different online platforms and the way they enable different people to take up different kinds of participation frameworks. So we were talking about commenting on one can simultaneously comment on the previous 5 commenters, and in doing that take up a position with respect to what the previous 5 commenters were commenting on. So those things become possible, various things become possible in this medium that can be analyzed in terms of good old Goffman and other categories like participation frameworks. I won't belabor that. Okay, so that's 2. 3, it is a fact that online materials are anonymous. We will never know, the joke about, if someone identifies themselves online as a 15-year-old girl, you know that they're a 56-year-old man, right? But the fact is, the material is anonymous. This may seem like kind of a downer, like we don't really ever have access to the people. Even if you were a brilliant hacker and you could get the IP address, that leads you to a terminal, not a person. Now, so we have no access to actual users, actual socio-demographic or other characteristics. We don't actually know their age, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and so forth. But I think, in a way, this is a bad thing from the point of view of traditional sociolinguistics, but it's a good thing in the sense that it forces us finally to abandon some of the frameworks of what I'm currently nicknaming Durkheimian sociolinguistics. This is the thing we're trying to get past. What do I mean by Durkheimian sociolinguistics? A view of society that sees that the individual is to society like a brick is to the facade of a building, okay? Rather than understanding the social as something that emerges from communicative practices, right? What I'm calling, by way of a kind of a slur, I guess, Durkheimian sociolinguistics is speaker-centric. We're always looking at what speakers do. The whole of Leboeuf's work is in a way an attempt to model an aspect of the linguistic competence of the individual. And of course, the entire Chomskyan enterprise is completely internalist and individualistic. So where's the interlocutor gone? So, the Durkheimian sociolinguistics views speaker sociodemographic characteristics as external, stable constraints on linguistic variation in performance. And this means the only kind of indexicality that can be handled is first order and presupposing. In other words, in the correlationist framework of, say, Lebovian sociolinguistics, you have, language is over here, society is over here, and they're kept totally separate, and we look for correlations. And, he gets a little more sophisticated, but it still views society as external to language, and it still views context as sort of external to the speech event, like the environment in which, like the non-linguistic environment in which speech events take place. And I won't go slavishly through this rather overpacked slide, but I mean, I think the kind of direction that sociolinguistics is taking under in recent work by Blomart, Rampton, many others, we're trying to remember the fact that context is something that's also created in and through acts of speaking. The context includes language. That's what you call cotext. Verbal forms don't just index external, it's not just like the word this indexes this thing. The word this can point to another part of here's the key word, text, right? Because verbal forms entering into indexical relationships with each other. So you could say something like, my point is this, right? So indexical forms can point to other forms in the text and to things perhaps outside the text. But what it means is verbal forms index each other. That's also known as textuality, not just external factors. And of course, I don't need to tell anyone in this room that we're kind of trying to move past a view of languages and of phonological variables as belonging to languages, but to look at registers and emblematic forms in ongoing processes of enregisterment. In other words, recurring or, configurations of forms in indexical relationships with each other that we experience as recurring, even if they're brand new. So what do we mean by register? And now, continuing my practice of you could call it polyvocal, or you could say I've kind of borrowed some PowerPoint slides from other people without giving proper attribution, except I'm giving proper attribution. Here's a PowerPoint slide by Michael Silverstein in which he talks about, which he counterposes the definition of register. The original definition of register comes from music and comes from the keyboard of an organ. Organs have those buttons above the keys, right? Some of them are for different registers. So in music, a register provides a distinctive and coherent timbral envelope for what would otherwise, in a different register, be precisely the same melodic sequence of pitch over time, the same notes. So that's a stretch of musical text. The same stretch of musical text can be, played on the organ with one setting and with another. So in language, a register provides a distinctive and coherent setting of verbal forms over a stretch of discourse as being appropriate to and indicative of the particular interactional contexts in which it occurs or could occur. So that's a verbal text. I also want to say right now, I guess pausing at the end of a Michael Silverstein slide is as good a place as any, that I completely welcome questions, interruptions. What did you mean by that? What are you talking about? I disagree, or just anything at all at any point. So is this making sense? You see the pipe organ language? So the melody the melody would be the kind of denotational content. So you can say, I had a heart attack. He had a heart attack. Or you can say, he had a myocardial infarction. And it conveys the sort of the same information, but if you say myocardial infarction, it sort of positions you as somebody who knows medical stuff, right? But the melody's the same, the register is different. Okay, so what this is based on is the existence in every community of language users of what you can call indexical paradigms, forms that contrast contextual in their that contrast not denotationally, but by the way they fit into the context of their use, or the way their use reshapes the context in which they are used. Both sides of the indexical process have to be part of our analysis. These are known in technical lingo, register, as when the indexical values of a verbal form, a verbal sign of any kind, a syntactic construction, a phonological variable, a word choice, when the indexical values of a given verbal form are as expected and are just what you were expecting to hear, that's what, that would be a presupposing indexical. It's presupposable. An entailing indexical is when somebody you expect to talk one way, to your surprise, talks another, or when someone even that you know says something in a way that you weren't quite ready for, and in understanding, in coming to an understanding of what is it, why did he say that thing to me in that way, right? You're coming to developing a new understanding of the relationship between what's being said and the act of saying it. So the intuition of congruent co-occurrence in discourse has to do with textuality. Certain paradigmatic forms seem to set expectations about the discourse unfolding over a stretch of verbal behavior, an indexically cohesive text. So the folk understanding, ethno-metapragmatics, citizen sociolinguistics is just that, right? It's just searching the web for ethno-metapragmatic data, nothing more exotic than that. The folk understanding of the social meaning or value of the register shibboleths, and thence of the register itself within the language community, is a relationship between a register shibboleth of a certain form and either the presupposition that the speaker has a certain kind of set of social characteristics, or as Blomart lately in conversation with me and maybe with you has been talking about in terms of biographical scripts, right? A person who pronounces this word in this way is a person who wears such and such type of shoes, has such and such type of a job. Behavioral scripts. Sorry, behavioral scripts. Yeah. Okay. Enough preliminaries. Now I'm going to do a little bit of reading, for which I apologize, but I will be interruptible. Okay. In 1962, Einar Haugen contributed a brief essay to this is part of a text read at the Georgetown University Roundtable Conference that Jan and I were both at, and the paper I'm referring to was given also at that conference, only in 1962 instead of 2015, so it was a little local flavor then. In 1962, Einar Haugen contributed a brief essay on a particular formation of speaker self-consciousness brought about by certain conditions of language standardization and endemic in, as he puts it, every complex civilized community. Writing at least partly tongue-in-cheek, Haugen attempted to diagnose a condition he called schizoglossia. And now a longish quote. Schizoglossia may be described as a linguistic malady which may arise in speakers and writers who are exposed to more than one variety of their own language. Exposed to more than one variety of their own language. So think about the internet as an environment in which people can get exposed repeatedly to more than one variety of their own language. Under favorable, or more precisely unfavorable conditions, the symptoms of schizoglossia may include acute discomfort in the region of the diaphragm and the vocal cords. The patient may also be afflicted by general insecurity, which expresses itself as false humility and needless self-deprecation. The damage to his character, we are told, may be incalculable. The victims of schizoglossia are often marked by a disproportionate, even an unbalanced interest in the form rather than the substance of language. In extreme cases, they may even turn into professional linguists, just as schizophrenics sometimes become psychoanalysts in order to study in others the symptoms of their own ailment. Okay, well, Haugen's discussion locates the phenomenon he calls schizoglossia, notice, right at the interface between the sociolinguistics science developed by and mostly for professional academic experts and popular discourses about language variation developed by and circulated among ordinary citizens. Further, it admits of the possibility that terms, concepts, discursive genres, and even people may circulate back and forth across the boundary between, licensed expert and citizen. The very terrain, as I see it, of citizen sociolinguistics. More to the point, I think it's interesting now to explore how new communication technologies associated with the internet and various digital platforms may facilitate and accelerate the repeated exposure of citizens to more than one variety of their own language. Such online materials offer a rich source of data on how it is that representations of particular, say, phonological and phonetic features become emblematic signs, in technical lingo, second-order indexes that typify a range of recognizable social identities and types of persons and behavioral scripts. This is the phenomenon. This set of phenomena is what I think ordinary people call accent. Brief digression. When I was preparing this paper, I looked at a bunch of widely used, at least widely used in the UK and US, intro linguistics textbooks, right? The very basic, you know these, Fromkin and Rodman, these things that go through 17 editions, right? And look at what they say about accent, and it's hilarious because they all have this kind of finger wagging, corrective, school teacher-like tone, and they say, what people call accent is actually, in scientific terms, phonological features associated with specific dialects. See glossary, dialect, right? It's not, right, so we speak of a Boston accent or a Southern accent, but what we really mean is dialect features of phonology. So there's just the nervousness is, this is a word linguists really don't like, accent. It's a word non-linguists really, really like, okay? Anyway, I'm not positioning myself explicitly with respect to that right now. As such, I'll be, so in talking about accent, if accent in some sense is a way of discussing the phonological features associated with dialects, language varieties, then the kind of discussion that I think citizen sociolinguistics does and that I'm interested in is really concerned mostly with what Labov called stereotypes. If you remember Labov's framework, there's indicators, markers, and stereotypes. Now, stereotypes are the least interesting of these for Labov. He defines stereotypes as, quote, that small number of sociolinguistic markers that rise to overt social consciousness, end quote. Labov, it will be remembered, discounted the importance and value of such phonological emblems precisely because they had risen to overt social consciousness. Such forms obscure, quoting again, the actual course of linguistic evolution, which is why the vernacular, quoting again, the vernacular in which minimum attention is paid to speech gives us the most systematic view of linguistic structure. So see how he's positioning the data of interest with respect to the conscious and cultured awareness of people, right? The variables that Labov called markers, the rate of production of which across any sample of speech, here we go. The rate of production of which across any sample of speech is a function of speaker socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic class, 0 is lower working class, 1 is working class, 2 to 3 is upper working class. I forget. This is the most famous chart in the history of sociolinguistics, I think, for reasons that are clear. The variables that Labov called markers, the rate of production of which across any sample of speech is a function of the intersection of speaker socioeconomic status and what Labov called contextual styles, casual speech, careful speech, reading, word lists, and minimal pairs, right? Provide much more systematic data so long as we accept Labov's definition of styles in terms of gradient degrees of speaker attention to and self-consciousness about speech. Okay, so the vertical axis, right, is the percentage of pronunciations of I mean, if you know, in a stretch of discourse, there are 100 opportunities in which one could say here, or one could say here, or one can say beard or beard, right? This is simply the rate of production of the R-full variable, okay? But the horizontal axis is what he calls contextual styles. So in A, it's the famous thing where Labov asked his people to describe the most frightening thing that had ever happened to them. Have you ever had a brush with death? And people start narrating their near-death experiences, and the idea is that if people are narrating their near-death experiences, they're getting so involved in the discourse that they lose their self-consciousness, they stop self-monitoring their pronunciation, and so you get the most vernacular, a sample of their most vernacular speech. Okay, B is just sort of the interview talk with the visiting interviewer. C, you hand them a piece of paper and you say, please read this aloud. D, you hand them a piece of paper with a list of individual words. And then finally, D prime is a piece of paper with minimal pairs on it, like the fact that, you know, working class people in the eastern US pronounce the word guard and the word capital G-O-D exactly the same. And so he was presenting, so D prime is him presenting people with a list of shibboleths of the most loaded kind possible. Now, I'm sorry to dwell on, I mean, this is old terrain, right? But I think it's important to see that really, for this chart to work, and of course the famous thing about this chart is what happened to the lower middle class 6 to 8 people, who as soon as these are task demands in experimental psychology lingo, right? Tell me the scariest thing. How long have you lived in this neighborhood? Read this aloud. These are task demands. For this chart to work, and the discovery of hypercorrection was huge, and the chart's brilliant, except for this chart to work, both axes have to be measuring an amount or a gradiently measurable amount of the same thing, right? In other words, here it's R-fullness, no argument with the vertical axis. But I mean, many people, Penny Eckert even, Michael Silverstein, many other people have observed that actually the horizontal axis is not measuring a homogeneous, a gradiently more or less present homogeneous thing. He's eliciting registers, right? And of course, the huge jump comes between careful speech and reading style. That's where the 6 to 8 lower middle class people start producing more R's than upper middle class people. They're social superiors, right? Well, why would that be? Is it the magic? Is it some kind of magical effect of the difference between orality and literacy? No, I don't think so at all. I think it's the fact that these task demands are actually register triggering activities. And if you hand someone who is lower middle class, like who has friends and relatives in the 0, 1, and 2, and 3 groups, and who maybe works with people from the 9 group, right? You hand them a sheet of paper and ask them to read it aloud. When is the last time they were asked to do that? The answer to that is school. So it's not about orality and literacy, it's about the fact that this task mobilizes a set of linguistic practices, a register, that for them takes them back to school. So they pronounce as much R as they can. Okay, now, even so here's one of Silverstein's, this is what he calls the cone of standardization. And I think it's kind of self-explanatory. I mean, well, is it? I mean, at the top and center is the standard. Whether, as in the case of America, it's an imaginary thing. I mean, in America, standard is not a type of speech that you can positively specify or describe phonologically. It's a construct. It's an idea. It's a kind of an imaginary thing. But what it really consists of in the American culture of standardization, and I think it's really important also to understand that differences between different cultures of standardization. It's not just it is not the same thing everywhere. In the American culture of standardization, standard is the absence of accent, more or less. In England, standard is completely specified phonologically, phonetically, lexically. It's called RP, or received pronunciation. And you have to go, there's 7 schools you can go to kind of become where those norms of pronunciation are disseminated to you in a way that you can actually speak, and of that variety. And of course, you know, every member of the current UK government speaks the current variety of that because they all went to exactly the same schools, right? But in England, the standard is positively specified, and the fact that only 15% of the population of England has ever actively spoken it makes no difference. Everybody knows what it is, and everybody knows where they are, where they live in the cone of standardization. Okay, but backwards. Okay, there's a final thing about Labov that I want to point to, which is the fact that for Labov, and quoting again, this is a really important sentence, I think. The ultimate significance of style switching, that's boom, 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 right? The ultimate significance of style switching is that it is governed by the recognition of an exterior standard of correctness. An exterior standard of correctness. This is like perhaps the one sentence in Labov's oeuvre where he acknowledges the importance of the fact that he was doing his research in a community with a standard language. But the interesting thing is the exterior standard of correctness. I mean, the question is whose recognition? And which standard of correctness? But most importantly, in what way is it exterior? Like, in other words, the hypercorrection pattern in this chart displayed by 6 to 8, the lower middle class speakers, is inside them. I mean, it's part of their embodied practice of talk. So, you see what I mean? So a Durkheimian sociolinguistics would say there's an exterior standard of correctness, it's imposed from above by society, and the individual feels the constraint, right? But in fact, these are in registered forms of practice. Okay. Finally, drawing on materials gathered over the last 10 years from a number of sources, including newspapers, online discussion boards, and YouTube, I want to sketch how a contemporary culture of accent centered in the super diverse Irish metropolis of Dublin can provide valuable material to address these questions for one main reason. Irish English, in its spoken form, has never been standardized. It's just simply a fact. It's neither standardized in the American way as a kind of imaginary absence of accent. No one in Ireland imagines that they don't have an accent. Lots of people in America do. Nobody in Ireland does. And it's certainly not standardized to norms from RP, which really would not fly for reasons I probably don't need to sketch. Contemporary accent culture in Ireland is fed by and feeds a robust traffic in the emblems of accent in spoken English. But interestingly, in these incredibly robust online discussions about accent, appeals to correctness are absent from the discussion. Instead of commenting on the accent sample by saying it's not correct or you should learn to speak correctly, what's questioned is its authenticity. It's just a different discourse. One commentator on the discussion board, boards.ie, talked about an alleged new accent in Dublin this way. It's a quote, "I personally feel like goring my eyes out when I hear that American accent. It's trendy now to sell yourself so as to sound more like a culture that's banjaxed, broken. It's more a sad reflection of the person who's speaking that way. You really want to kill yourself if you have the terrible luck of having to go into an Abercrombie shop here. Hey guys, sup?" I respond with a look of absolute hatred. My immediate point of departure is the excessive overproduction of verbal and graphemic representations of accent in the mediatized public sphere. Such ecstasies of communication and crosstalk are a common feature of Web 2.0, but where Irish accents are the explicit topic, the comment threads display features that might be definitional of an emerging public of citizen sociolinguists in distress. Whether vilifying or praising their own accents or others, commenters seem unable to resist the urge to present and thereby recirculate samples of what they're talking about. I mean, the way to make fun of someone's accent, to say someone's accent is terrible, is to produce a sample. And so thereby keeping it all circulating. So it seems like in this case that the Irish English is being shaped more by an imaginary of, more by a calculus of ethno-national authentic essences than by a calculus of deviation from standard. It's not really, the cone is not quite shaped that way in Ireland. If Irish people suffer from schizoglossia, it is a very different kind from that described by Haugen. Now, first, I just want to talk about a kind of the way Dubliners imagine the sociolinguistic world, and it's kind of, to put it a little oversimply, it's kind of a cross. Never thought about that before. No, but I mean, in other words, on the vertical dimension, there's kind of a group of people imagined at the top who are known as D4s, named after a postal code in South Dublin where rich people live. And at the bottom are people called scangers, or scobies, or scumbags. Even below the bottom are people called knackers, which are members of the Irish traveling community. But scangers are basically the Irish version of chavs, if you know the British term. Okay, I mean, it's tracksuit bottoms and jewelry and a certain walk. And, so it's the top and bottom there. And then on the horizontal, kind of like there are kind of like two kinds of outsiders or two kinds of others, country people of whatever variety, Irish people who are from the country, known as culchies. And then there are, of course, the many, many new migrants to Dublin. So there's a kind of imaginary at work there. And here's a map of the Dublin area rapid transit, which goes along with a little quote here from this really brilliant humor writer in Dublin who writes under the name Ross O'Carroll Kelly. Get it? R-O-C-K. I mean, his real name is Paul Howard. But Ross O'Carroll Kelly is this grotesque, wealthy, spoiled Celtic tiger kind of guy who made a lot of money in real estate in 2004. So it's all in that voice. So he's talking about the Dublin area rapid transit. So here's the quote. Those intrepid souls, I won't read it in D4. Those intrepid souls who are prepared to stay on for the entire hour-long journey, running the risk of being robbed at knife point, will notice the way the name of the service changes according to local dialects. In the well-off North Dublin suburbs of Howth, Sutton, and Bayside, you can see Howth, Sutton, and Bayside. So see that little kind of peninsula sticking out there, Howth? Okay, there's the train you're on, okay? In the well-off North Dublin suburbs of Howth, Sutton, and Bayside, it's known as the Dort. As it passes through Kilbarrack, Colester, and Harmonstown on its way to city centre, it becomes the Dert. When it crosses the Liffey, skirting the coast of Dublin 4, the vowel sound becomes softer again, and it sounds more like the Dort. Through Glenageary, Dalkey, and Killiney, it becomes the Dort. When it reaches Shankill, it's Die Fucking Train. And by the time it reaches Bray, it's just something people throw stones at. It's just such a great, I love that. The mock dialectology of Dublin in this passage suffices to point to one dimension of variability, what Gumpert's called dialectal variation, involving what Labov called indicators, the mutability of accent across different zones of urban space, where neighborhood effectively serves as a proxy for class. Surveying the vast online archive of Irish citizen sociolinguistics, however, shows that this concern is far outweighed by another, the mutability of accent in the speech of individuals, who are frequently presented in reported vignettes switching back and forth between accents. So actually, the passage is completely misleading, right? Because the important fact to remember is that whether you live, the people who live in Bray and are throwing stones at the train know that they are inhabiting a sociological imaginary in which they are supposed to do that, if you see what I mean. In other words, it isn't quite dialectology in that way. Okay, now we will see, okay, there's Dublin 4, the prosperous area and postal district from which an extreme form of fashionable Dublin English formerly took its name. Now, let's see if this works. And if it doesn't, I've got a plan B. But this is going to be this will become self-explanatory, I hope. Bought.
And it's great.
Okay, so the first part was, of course, Scanger, and the second part was D4. She will now explain better than I can what's going on. Let's see if this...
Slot. Northsider versus Deep Forehead.
Okay.
Accent challenge. For those of you who don't live in Ireland and basically do not have the slightest idea of what a Northsider and a Deep...
Just try that again.
North.
I have this also. Escape. Sorry.
Right-hand side, right, up, yeah. No, yeah, yeah.
There we go. Okay. Let's see if this is any.
Northsider versus deep forehead.
Yeah.
Accent challenge. For those of you who don't live in Ireland and basically do not have the slightest idea of what a Northsider and a deep forehead are, well, basically these are two very stereotypical images in Ireland, based in Dublin, and they're pretty much like black and white, like complete opposites of each other. Well, basically, the stereotypical image of a Northsider is, how do I say this without being pretty like inhumane about the top? To be kind of scruffy, rough, not really in the best economic state, kind of alcoholics, druggies, kind of dirty, aggressive, don't really take care of themselves. You get the drift. And the stereotypical image of a deep forehead is the complete opposite of a Northsider. A deep forehead is somebody who lives in the D4, Dublin Forest, outside of Dublin, and is pretty much really well off, kind of spoiled, really like rich. Goes to private schools, plays rugby, spoiled, loaded, stuck up their own ass, posh.
So she's told you, right, what I was just telling you. And the comments on this video include a lot of praise for her performance and many indecent proposals. There are many commenters from America, Australia, Mexico, the UK, and elsewhere, and one of them says, "Good role play." But the thing is, this is very common. How I got into this was when I first arrived in Ireland. I met someone, the partner of a friend of mine, and within the first conversation I had with her, she started producing Dublin accents by postal code. She says, "Okay, I'll do a D8," and she did it, and I'll do a D4, of course, and then she did it, and do a D9. You know, she had like a repertoire of 6 or 8 of them that she could just do on demand. And I've come to discover this is very common. This is, quite routine. Now let's look at let's look at another one that is kind of it's part of something Betsy Rhymes has written about this. Are you aware of something called accent tag? It's a YouTube mimic kind of yeah. Okay, so here's an accent. It's where people go. It's this list. It's this list of single words developed by 2 linguists at Harvard who I'd never heard of before, who basically stole the list from Hans Kurrat's Atlas of American English Dialects. So they're all words that are, have diagnostic value for dialects. But the thing is, the list has now circulated around the world to places where the dialects being produced being targeted in those word lists aren't even around. But here's sort of, so there was a staged performance of a double staged performance of accent, and okay, I need to go back to my. Where is it? There? No. Back to the slides for a second. Oh, of course. Got it. All right, thank you. All right, so here's a guy this is a real Northsider, doing the accent tag thing.
Right, this is the Irish accent tag system in the front page. Now, I'm following this from a video that was just put up.
Put up.
I don't know where your website is for the list of stuff, you know what I mean? So this is just what you see on the other Irish one. Like, she's a country girl, so this is a Dublin accent. Because it's different. So we'll go for the words first. Garage, hair, schedule, figure, jaguar, lieutenant, water, advertisement, valve, route, ballet,
tomato. Now, this is it seems like the interesting thing there is, with these accent tag videos is to listen to the way they talk when they're addressing the camera versus the way they talk when they're reading the list of words. This seems to be, this guy appears to use his real name. identifies himself in comments as being from Drimna, which is a working class area. And in the comments, there are all kinds of positive reactions. Good work, lad. And there's even an offer for work as a voice actor. Okay? So there's a very positive, very, very positive kind of reception. Now, for something, well, there was the list of words. Okay. Bingo. Now, something, I hope this is the one, I've played this in Washington, and to a room full of diverse people, many of whom had English as a first language. Not one of whom could make out a word of this. I can translate some of it for you, but I won't do it simultaneously. But this is called Dublin Scumbag, Steo Taken to Piss in My Room. That's the title. Now, note, taken to piss means making a joke, means pretending, right? So, here we go.
Right, Leonard, this is the phone I found on the road. Found on the bus actually. Some outlet said he dropped the phone, but I just kept the secret.
Oh, shit, sorry.
Right, Leonard, this is the phone I found on the road. Found on the bus actually.
On the bus.
Some outlet said he dropped the phone, but I just kept the secret. Want to wait? Yeah. There you go. Found this one up on the taxi rate. Has a sexy word on it. But the bus driver, I mean, the taxi man, sorry that's no, but it's like me, my man, it is. 2-pack or what?
2-pack or what?
Anyway, I found this phone on the taxi. The taxi man wouldn't let me have it, so I stabbed him with a pencil sharpener. So then I ran off with the phone.
Okay. Comments on Dublin Scumbag come in 3 general types. Number 1, there are a large number of these. I'm just for now calling it vituperation directed at the represented figure. Here's one example. What? Half of this video should have subtitles. Pardon my language alert. Okay, this is data. Half of this video should have subtitles. What a fucking asshole. The name of this vid says it all. Piss off back to your slum and collect your methadone prescription. There's a lot of that. There's also debunking comments that identify this thing as a performance. One of them says simply, in all caps, sham. And then another person says, LOL typical, a rebel offspring of a middle-class family acting as a scumbag. This place just gets worse and worse as the days go on. And then finally, there's an offstage, backstage comment by the producer of the clip, the people who put it up, oh wait, I think I have these. Yes, here we go. I just want to make one ting clear, totally on purpose, right? The TH pronounced as T is a shibboleth. I just want to make one thing clear. It was a fucking mess video. Don't take it to heart, yous fucking thicks. Meaning we're just joking, right? So, heavily staged. Okay, I'm wrapping it up now. One might ask how, we could do D4 syndrome. Should we do D4 syndrome? Okay, I forgot about this one. This is pretty funny. The image quality is poor, and I've got a little handy partial transcription for you there.
Welcome to a short interview with a D4. D4 syndrome has attacked the whole of Dublin right now. People are walking around with heavy makeup, bad tan, and hair that looks like these of Neptune. D4s are a very sad culture. We are going to ask this poor girl, Dervla, how she feels. So Dervla, what's it like being a D4?
Oh my god, it's like super fantastic.
Stop. It's okay. So, what do you eat?
Well, usually like I
her, and she's in my eye like that.
Okay. One might ask how, if Irish English has never been standardized according to any stable codified norms of pronunciation, lexis, or syntax, it could ever be acquired other than on the fly in situated social encounters, in the Goffman sense of the word. But in fact, attempts are underway in the city to do just this in classes for migrants and other newcomers, classes one might call not ESL, but DSL, Dublinese as a second language. Here, a version of the working class North Side dub accent is both the language being taught and the medium of instruction. And pedagogical discourse in the classroom provides both typifications of accent and situated instances of the social uses of accented speech in situated encounters. Now, before I play this clip, there's a word mot, M-O-T, that means spouse, as used by a man of a woman. So far I'm having really good luck with these.
Alright? Alright? Everybody say alright? Alright. And everyone say roast potatoes. Roast potatoes. It's not potatoes, it's potatoes. It's like a big potato. Scorching. Scorching. When do you say that? Like when it's roasting.
How about piss in the rain? Is that a word as well?
Alright, class. Now Fell. Board.
Board.
Cracker on the board. Brussels sprouts. 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 Hard word, isn't it?
In 1994, the Irish Independent newspaper reported the results of a survey of 1,000 people under the headline, Accent on Who We Love to Hate. Here's a quote. 2/3 of those polled believe that our accent can always indicate our regional origins. Only 30% feel there is such a thing as a neutral accent when we speak English. Our accent may be a dead giveaway about our origins, but it can also provoke strong feelings among some people. The Dublin accent was mentioned the most often, being liked by 10% of the respondents, but being disliked by 13%. We also have something called a social class accent, and we are more likely to be judged by this than by our regional accent. It is interesting to observe, end of quote, it is interesting to observe in Ireland a sociolinguistic imaginary so obsessively focused on the indexical strength or power of accent. What we observe in the facts of accent is the power that these non-referential indexicals have when they are encountered in oral speech or online. Above all, their power performatively to entail the mutual localizability of every speaker in a number of differentially shared social spaces in a Dublin-centric cosmos. Here is a matter about which the citizens of Dublin are truly experts, while academic linguists and sociolinguists have been almost totally silent. More to the point, it seems that accent culture becomes a way for citizen sociolinguists to seize on erstwhile phonological variables to manage their co-presence and to achieve conviviality, as we saw in the Dublin, the classroom right there just then, in a super diverse metropolis that continues to experience socio-demographic and economic shocks. All of this in the absence of a standard language. It is even more interesting to observe that this accent culture is an integral part of a much larger national imaginary in which themes of dislocation, absence, emigration, and exile loom so large. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Oh. Rewire.
Okay. Let's see. Yep. There we go.
All right.
Right now, I'll be brief, and I'm not going to do the entire thing that I had planned because it's not all that important and it's very unfinished. But you will see that it actually latches onto a few of the things that Rob, let me see, okay, that Rob mentioned. For instance, I mean, it's all about indexicality. Indexicality being, and as you've seen in the beginning when he mentioned what was it, the shibboleths, it is an emblem that basically points to something. And here the issue is, what exactly? And in the sort of research that I myself like, and also would like you guys to do, it's all about realism. So what is the sort of baseline reality that we see in our data, as represented in narratives, in storytelling, in anecdotes, but also, for instance, in these YouTube clips, in these videos, all right? And then you will see that it's very often, or at least, you know, here say this is the standard sort of definition of indexicality from a linguistic feature, a thing like an accent, or, you know, rhoticity, the R in New York, and so on and so on, straight to identity. Okay, but then again, what exactly do we mean? And I'll get into that. There's a theoretical sort of representation of indexicality as being a general abstract sort of notion, of which the single instance would then be the token, all right? Accent, of course, is the clear field in which that plays. And then here's the question, what exactly is identity? And what I did was I use Google Image, and I use it a lot because it's really great data in the sense that it brings all, you know, the social stereotypes magnificently to the fore. And I just Googled working class accent. Working class accent. This is what I got. Working class accent. So you get the Spice Girls, okay, then you get something from a TV series, and then you get, hi, my name is Michael Caine, and then you get David Beckham, etc., etc. All right. So it is interesting, you know, that visuality, or at least, you know, that accent clearly triggers particular forms of visuality. Let's now dig a little bit deeper into one or two of them, because we can see that the indexical field itself is actually very, very, very specific. All right, so we begin to see something that I would like to call a behavioral script. Okay, so working class accent in reality stands for this. It is an image of behavior, right? And a sort of a range of different features of behavior that we relatively automatically seem to invoke whenever we hear that accent or invoke that particular type of individual. Now go back to doing the D4 syndrome, all right? It was all about hairdo, you know, and bags, and then comes the accent. Also, in a number of the other examples that we've seen, it's not just about accent, it is about accent, well, appears to be nested in what we call a behavioral script, in all these other features. So here, working class accent clearly refers to smoking, alcohol, the pub, right? Think of EastEnders, being unemployed, being very badly dressed, being rude. Shameless is very often a label you would find. They're shameless, they have no shame, and of course if they bring their children to the pub, the children are very poorly, let's say, raised and educated as well. So we see a very precise bundle of features, you know, that appear to be triggered by Google, let's say by Google Images, as a response to an abstract, or at least a vocal notion of working class accent. Let's take another one here, another one of these images that you've seen. Here again, working class accent appears to be associated with specific ways of being, all right? So with behavioral scripts, again, you know, there's, let's say, premature pregnancies, also the fact that people are not highly educated, but also national chauvinism, all right? You know, English chauvinism, English nationalism, regionalism, you know, sounds working class. So it's that sort of very broad, but at the same time, very specific, very precise, let's say, behavioral field that is, let's say, rather systematically triggered by these notions of accent. So here we have an idea of indexicality as a thing that emerges as a very concrete, let's say, range of things. It's not an abstract given, it is a very practical thing. And of course, you know, all of that, let's say, the stuff we have already seen is, of course, you know, supported by the entertainment business. I'm sure most of you know Onslow from Keeping Up Appearances. Note, of course, a series entirely devoted, you know, to class anxieties, right? Keeping Up Appearances, in the sense, you know, that she pretended to be very, very upper class or whatever, but that's her family, and her family is the visual working class. I mean, he spoke with a working class accent, but also look at him, you know, he is, he's unemployed, very badly dressed, he drinks, he smokes, and he was watching horse racing most of the day. You also see it here in memes, right? So these are the chavs, and here you see a visuality. They're wearing these track suits, but they're also producing language, you see? So you see, this is an activity that you see, but it's not just a linguistic activity. It's not just an interaction activity. It is also a display of emblematic visualities. And also referring to emblematic behavior, a behavioral script that is nicely associated with their identity of being chavs. And of course the chav is this one. At one point Pia and I wrote a very interesting paper about it. You actually don't need much in order to be identified as a chav. You need the wrong beer and you need the Burberry tartan. And the two will go together. This is unmistakably a chav. So you see features that are a lot broader than language, but in a way they are an envelope around language. Okay, so they refer to each other. The accent refers to these particular features, and the features refer to the accent. And in that sense, you basically create a field of realistic investigation, which is a little bit broader than the vocal, the acoustic, etc., and it matters. All right, those are not details. Those are the things, you know, that appear as a bundle of features in that folk sociolinguistic, or let's say citizen sociolinguistic environment that Rob so wonderfully described. And in fact, we've seen lots and lots of hints in the data that he presented from Ireland. It's not just British, of course. We have our own homegrown chavs, the new kids here. And again, I mean, do add detail as we go along. It is not just about how they speak, all right? It is also how they look. Look at them, right? It's about hairdo. Of course, they're rural, they're unemployed. I mean, their opinions about women are not all too nice. They eat junk food. They drink beer. They're very poorly dressed. The hairstyle is a bit of an issue, and of course, they live in weird things. So we see multiple features of bad behavior. And here is a second layer. So we see features, okay, and the features are, let's say, in many ways inscribed in the visual representation of these people, but there is a moralization of the features going on, all right? So the features are also marked morally as bad. That's not me. I'm not like that. Okay? So in other words, the features are not a neutral description, they are a moralization, a moral judgment, basically. And so you have essentially empirically two layers. One is identifiable features, but the second layer is also the judgment, the moral judgment of the features as either being okay, like me, or not okay, and of course that is them. And if you take all of this together, what you have is the thing I label here as, I mean, if you take all of that, a number of individual situations become readable. Okay, so you can begin to understand a situation like the one we see there as being readable on the basis of these moralized features. So here we see, you know, things, weird things being done with a woman. We see transgressive behavior. We see the junk food even. What's his name again? Henk? The snack bar owners, all right? So, in other words, reality becomes readable on the basis of not just, you know, accents or things like that, but the bundles of moralized features in a way. Okay. So in that sense, this is, I mean, one of the things that Goffman emphasized. We never try to make sense of a word or an utterance. We try to make sense of a situation. Okay. A real life situation, a situation as it is developing, not just in our ears, but in our eyes as well, very often. All right. And here again, I mean, if we do this work on the internet, I mean, visuality will be very, very hard to avoid. So here's an idea that we might want to explore a little bit. Well, I'm not going to go into this because it's just all confirmation. But what we see here is, so when we ask the question about indexicality, authenticity, identity, what exactly is it? All right. Well, in reality, when we look at the sort of data that Rob, you know, has produced here, we see that very often it all resides around accounts of social events, of real social events, right? And in which we see that the indexical arrow is not just from something very specific, like a feature of pronunciation, to something abstract. No, it's a lot more concrete. It is one feature, one real observable feature in relation to other real observable features, even if they function as a stereotype, right? So it's a very precise and it's a very concrete thing. It's not abstract at all. And of course, now we need to realize, of course, that the range of, say, features is broadly behavioral. Language is always an element in it, but not necessarily never the only one, and not necessarily the most important one. So very often it can also be language-less and still readable as working class, for instance, with an expectation that as soon as they would start speaking, you would hear a working class accent. And then again, you know, the surprise if it is, oh, my old boy, you don't expect that from Onslow, for instance. No, it needs to sound working class, right? So that's the way in which these particular scripts also work. They create expectations, iconic expectations, and so on and so on. Important point, they are moralized, and it is the moralization that basically shapes identity. An identity emerges at the moment of the moral judgment. I don't like this, i.e., they are not like me, all right? I like it, i.e., they are like me. And so I'm a member of this and not of that on the basis of the moral judgment. So here's morality basically as a sort of big stratifier in a way, as the thing, the moral judgment that basically makes identities into what they are as a lived reality, as a social reality, and as a way of making sense of real situations, even more as a way of reading social structure into real situations, as a way of understanding real events in real life as being open for judgment on the basis of recognizable features. So that's basically the idea that I had, and it was completely triggered by the material that was presented during that workshop at GERT in Washington, which we have now nicely replayed. Thank you very much. And of course, and the debate is open. We have another hour. It's up to you now. Basically, two things have been raised: citizen sociolinguistics as a field, in a way, and then as a sort of object, behavioral scripts, if we wish. Both could be useful. Or shall we have a 5-minute break before that? Before we get together for a bit of a brainstorm, a 5-minute break? Okay. Is that okay with you? A 5-minute break? Yeah. Then we can go for a smoke. we working classes.
Exactly.
Any remarks, any observations, comments, suggestions? Let the brains storm, I would say. During the cigarette break, there was also already two things. Sometimes they can be covert prestige.
Yeah.
For a stigmatized accent, it can still carry covert prestige, and I think that's true. And maybe there the line to explore is how strictly that is fitted into a culture of standardization or an ideology of standardization, right? Mm-hmm. For instance, it might not have that prestige in a school context. It might have, let's say, the prestige in an entertainment context. If you think of Rasta jargon, patois, very low prestige in the educational context in Jamaica, no prestige at all actually. But of course, huge prestige in the world of reggae worldwide, and I think that sort of reversal might be a feature that we want to explore as well. Yeah. Another thing was, are these judgments always moral? I mean, I don't know. Let's explore. My feeling is, well, here's Bakhtin, who always emphasized that meaning is judgment, right? It's not like a purely automatic uptake in the brain, of things that are already there and that are recognized by, a sort of neural interface. No, it is a judgment. It is a social judgment. And then here you have that little quote by Sikurel, actually, reading social structure into, or at least looking for social structure into really occurring events in life in such a way that these events, these particular situations begin to be understandable for us on the basis of the scripts that we have about them. So in that sense, my feeling is there will always be judgment, but whether we want to call it a moral judgment, an aesthetic judgment, a political judgment, yeah, I mean, all of that is open. Yeah.
You have to take into account, I think that especially in the data that we use now,
Yeah.
from YouTube, for instance, humor or irony plays a very important role, and that has something, that's some influence on the moral judgment, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Rob, I think that fits into your idea of mediation.
Yeah.
So that these data are mediated by all sorts of things.
Yeah.
You want to reflect on because we saw a lot of humor in your data as well, or at least pun or irony.
Well, I think part of the, for lack of a better word, staged quality of the YouTube clip is it sort of invites the viewer to take up a certain kind of footing with respect to the character being portrayed, and all kinds of signals and, in a way, suggestions of how, how the viewer should evaluate in a way, all kinds of clues to an evaluative stance that the viewer can adopt with respect to the, right? The D4 syndrome thing is staged. I mean, look at that staging, the girl, I'm going to do an interview with a very sad, it's sort of pathologized, it's got all this sort of medical jargon. She lists the symptoms, kind of like schizophrenia, and then the girl just exemplifies it. And so we're there watching the both of them, and of course, the interviewer in that one is sort of a surrogate for us. We're supposed to look with scorn, pity, and humor at this poor girl. Anyway.
Go ahead.
I just would like to comment on how you say it's basically regarding language status, whether we should be judgmental towards other language or not towards how other people speak, because this can be very dangerous, it's very serious, as a language, as a status thing. And therefore, I think we should just celebrate the diversity of languages, dialects, and way of speaking. In a way, if we consider language as something not that we use, but something that we do, in a sense, in a creative way, that should be celebrated. No, that's the diversity of languages and slang, and the way we're using, we doing it, should be celebrated in that way as something creative and diverse and representative of different parts of society, people, ways of life, etc.
And I mean, that happens, and it doesn't happen. I mean, the interesting thing, and I believe that's also in your data, is when you look at the comment section, all right, you would very often see enormously different appraisals of what happens there. People liking it and actually getting the fun of it, then others being deeply offended by it. We've seen examples there. And in fact, we were talking about this that just before the meeting here, in your data as well, we would see differentiation. People basically saying, oh yeah, this is cool, this is new, this is great, versus people saying, yes, but. So all of that is around. All of these forms of uptake are around, and I would say they belong basically to that field of citizen social linguistics. How do we describe these ways of say judging the entire phenomenon at a very high level of is it socially appropriate or not? Is it desirable or not? Do we want this or not, and so on? All of the data are out there. And in general, I think whatever contains that sort of ironic dimension will always prompt enormously contradictory reactions. So in that sense, well, let's have a look at it. We haven't done so yet, so data. You want to add something to it?
No, I mean, I don't, yeah, I mean, I think the issue of diversity that you just raised is an important one, but partly because it's operating at a couple of different levels. Like, in other words, these kinds of clips, like the ones I played, are representations of kinds of diversity, but then there's also, in constructing these clips, the people who made them are celebrating or sometimes denigrating people's, well, the relationship between their language and the behavioral scripts that are indexed thereby. So there's kind of a couple of, and very often, I mean, in my material, I mean, the only on-screen figure that I think isn't quite obviously being presented as an act is the guy doing the accent tag thing. The rest of them are highly theatricalized and highly performed. You know, the scumbag is not even a real scumbag. I mean, he's doing a pretty good job, but of playing one, but he isn't one, right? I mean, you can, if you look, you know, when you hit YouTube with Dublin scumbags, you can get, what you get is people's phone videos of fights in the street between chavs, right? They're not linguistically that interesting, but like what I gave you is highly, if not scripted in the literal sense of having written out lines memorized. I don't think it is that, but it's highly staged. So there's diversity both in what's being represented and how it's being represented. And there's a lot of borrowing of formats. The kind of medical interview, the clinical interview with the girl, the two-camera monologue of the scumbag, the first girl giving the two accents and then giving her little mini lecture, kind of a didactic for those of you who aren't from Dublin. So there's a lot of adoption of different kinds of voicings and different kinds of ways of modes of addressing the viewer.
And so the evaluation, just to make that point very clear, is always an element of that. It cannot be extracted from it. So in the data, you already have the ideological judgment of what is represented there. That is what creates the mise en scène in a way.
Yes.
That is the thing that creates the voice, the tone, but even, you know, the way they dress, like the Dublin scumbag is wearing this weird thing around his head. And he actually identifies it as a feature of being a scumbag. So again, you see, so it's all there. Ideology can never be extracted from language or from, let's say, semiotics. It's always there. And that is the entire idea behind citizen sociolinguistics, that we not just look at this material as just recorded language data, but as data that are what was it again? The total linguistic fact, which is already mediated by ideologies, by social position, all right, by as a consequence also by interests, and in that sense never neutral. And it's up to us now to try to make sense of that. I mean, the fact that in Dublin you have 4 or 5 different, let's call it direct zones, but they're not really direct zones. They are internalizations of accents that are being played out by, let's say, different social positions, and that can be grouped in one repertoire. I can have all 5 of them, and there's nothing wrong with me. I can still be a D4, I guess, or you know, somebody from D6, or so in that sense, you know, it's always there, and it's up to us now to try to make sense of it. So, but I do think, I mean, let me now return the questions to you. I do think it resonates with a lot of the data that you guys have been looking at. Certainly, I mean, new kids explicitly there. There's no doubt about that. But also, I mean, with a number of the other projects that are around. And also, I mean, if we think about the new teaching program next year, students will have to get assignments. Those could be the sort of assignments we want to give them. Look at some data, look at, you know, how we see these local ideas about what is good and what is bad language, what is acceptable and what not, and how it fits with broader behavioral, say, features. It could be a really interesting way of going about it. And in that sense also support the UPenn GSE project on citizen social linguistics. Jeff?
Yeah, perhaps a quick question for clarification. As it's formulated here, identity seems to be a sort of heuristic that is productive, and by either taking an identification stance or a separation stance of particular features.
Yeah.
But what else is in between, or how can that be interpreted?
I don't know. I don't know. This is a line that needs to be developed. But the fact that there isn't like a reservoir of identity features unless a judgment has been made about it, and the judgment is usually part of a real social event in which you engage with other people and you like it or not. Now think about Facebook. It's all about liking or not liking. And then, of course, we very often overlook the moral dimensions of identity. I am this is, for instance, if I say I am an academic, it is not just a neutrally descriptive statement, it is in a way also a statement of morality. So my behavior will be in line with the expected behavior of academics. So in that sense, we very often overlook that point. And then incidentally, yesterday we got an email from, amongst other people, Pia, saying that on campus we will raise a team of, say, disciplinary people working on morality, because you see a lot of it in data such as those. Even in a way playfully articulated, perhaps. Let's look at it, but it is very much there.
Yeah. Your work remind me of the French philosopher Jean Briard. His work on consumerism, and he stated that there seems to be a turn from nature to culture, concerning the product or the commodity, because it's not only about the thing or the usefulness, it's about its indexicality or those qualities imposed on those things.
Yeah, and that makes it so flexible and so volatile and so on. Yeah. Rob, just chip in if you need the mic. Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, for your very reassuring talk, especially because I'm doing comments analysis, and that's really reassuring. I think you're giving a place for this, for just reading YouTube comments or online comments and say I'm studying something. Well, thank you. And I actually have a technical methodological issues about analyzing comments, because I think the data you presented are very rich, and I think comments are just part of that.
Yes.
Yeah, and but when analyzing the comments, I think online comments are very assertive, sophisticated maybe, and sometimes are very short, but they are very complex. I think there are complexities of different ideologies, notions, or ideological orientations within. But sometimes you have just to discover the different ideological considerations within a very simple comment, such as the positive reception that you just showed us. Maybe it's about the video, the performance, the staged performance. Maybe it's about the accent that the actor is doing. Yes. So that's my puzzle during my analysis. Sometimes you have to wonder what kind of ideological orientations are being indexed, or So that's my question.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, where to start? Okay, I mean, I wish I had had time to do a more thorough and job of analyzing the comments. And I really didn't, I mean, I wouldn't hold that part of what I did here up as an exemplar for you, because I was hearing about some of your analyses earlier today about, you know, a sequence of smiley face emoticons followed by a smiley face with a tear emoticon, which then takes up a position with respect to the you know, like the conditions under which that smiley face with a tear can become meaningful are partly created by the fact that 4 or 5 plain old smiley faces have preceded. It can be a further, kind of like a further refined position with respect to them and with respect to the thing itself. I mean, part of what got me into this actually early on was the comments as much as the material, because I kept seeing that in comments, both negative moral judgments and positive moral judgments, both of them so often contained more accent imitations in the comment. So even if you're criticizing something, you know, you say, I am so tired of these fools who say, and then you know, you go into this, you know, deviant spelling and the yeah, this is a field that needs to be, I mean, this aspect of it, comment analysis, is something that really needs to be developed, and it looks like you are doing some fantastic and important work. No, I'm totally serious with respect to that, because part of the, you know, like they say, the affordances of this technology are affordances that enable forms of intertextuality, that enable, right, so that a comment has to be analyzed for its position with respect to other comments, that some of which it may directly address, like, hey, so-and-so, 16 comments above, you're wrong or you're right. But, you know what I'm saying? Just the structure itself lends its, the format of the technology just enables all kinds of very, very efficient, you know, very economical acts of intertextual reference by echoing, by ironically echoing somebody else's comment, by approving it, disapproving it. There's a whole range of evaluative and moral positions.
And it's very hard to analyze in the sense, I mean, sometimes you can see a discussion entirely drift off track into a completely different sort of theme, not really triggered by the object itself, but by, you know, preceding comments. Then another function is, of course, that those who enter later onto the forum have access to the things that are already there, and then specifically create a new position in relation to the other commentators. And I was just wondering, I mean, Gangnam Style, so 2.5 billion viewers and 300,000 comments. Is there anybody who doesn't have a PhD topic? 300,000 comments on one thing, but there, for instance, I expect massive diversity within the comments itself, depending on all sorts of things. I mean, the earliest comments by now should be how old? 3-4 years old? Gangnam Style?
12.
So that's 3 years, yeah. So that's old, right? But there would be new ones every day. So in that sense, I mean, it's a never-ending sort of archive of reactions as well that is being built up. And in the meantime, of course, the very first reactions were to something that had no impact yet. It was virtually unknown. But of course, what is now being, let's say, written as a reaction must be influenced by this gigantic success of the video itself. So it's really hard to analyze, but then again, you know, we're not afraid of hard work, are we? It doesn't need to be easy to be interesting, right?
It's always also linked to so-called offline life. BB King dies, and a clip that hasn't had comments in 3 years may get suddenly analyzed.
Trigger 300, yeah, absolutely. Any other points at this stage?
There is, looking at this type of data, you think back of the days in which we tried to collect as clean and as naturalistic data as possible. So you wouldn't interview a dialect speaker who misses one or two teeth because
Yeah.
it sounds different. You need somebody with a whole and perfect pair of
Set
teeth.
of
Yes,
teeth.
yes.
Set of teeth. Otherwise, it's spoiled data.
Mm-hmm.
What we see now is something like naturalistic data, but mediated, spoiled,
Yes.
changed, distorted,
Manufactured,
in whatever way.
Yes.
So an interesting question is, when you analyze these data, and that's basically what we ended up with, the data as such are probably just to be considered as triggers for all the other data that are more interesting than the actual linguistic data. The linguistic data might be staged, might be invented, might be false, might be joking, might be even taken into a commercial feature, a movie or whatever.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But it's the reactions and the smileys and whatever
Yes.
thumbs up things that count.
Yes.
On the other way, I could also imagine that the data as they are, that I just call triggers,
Mhm.
could be considered as real data because they kind of reflect essentialist ideas about what a
Yeah.
dialect is. They reflect
Yep.
normativity, they reflect
Yeah.
ideology and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, what are we looking at the comments or at the data as such? And I think they have both their value, going
Yeah.
back to this idea of what is real and what is not real.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of things that we are laughing about now, and that I think what your comment was about, a lot of the things that we are laughing about now, we would have criticized 10 years ago as improper making fun of dialect speakers.
New kids.
And now we think, oh, that's interesting,
Yeah.
that's nice, but
Yeah.
I could also imagine to be negative about
Yeah.
it, because it is essentialist and it depicts speakers as people who don't know
Yeah.
language or who make mistakes
Mhm.
Mhm.
from a
Yeah.
perspective of normativity, which, you see, there is
Yeah.
kind of a multi-layered problem here in terms of
Yeah.
what is data.
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably we only look at actors in the sense of, not actors in the sense of stage, but
Mhm.
actors in the sense of people who make meaning in
Yeah.
totally two different ways.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
even more. Yeah.
Or
Well,
even more.
yeah. I mean, I think one thing to remember is that, you know, the sort of older kind of dialectology was in the service of, was partly in the service of a larger project, which was to understand how languages change. So you want to find, the best dialect speakers would be, I love this acronym. You've probably seen it, but it's in like Trudgill, and when he worked in England, those British dialect surveys, you're looking for people called norms, and that's non-mobile older rural males, because you see they are thought to preserve the most conservative form of the dialect. So in a way, there's that whole idea of apparent time. So the oldest, somebody who's never traveled outside the region, somebody who has limited education, is speaking the language the way it was spoken 100 years ago. So data from them then become part of a larger project that really is to do with language change. And LeBeouf's first project was Martha's Vineyard. That was about language change. That was about how a change sweeps across a population, and maybe stops at certain places and continues. So the spread of the wave-like spread of a linguistic change over a community of speakers. That was the kind of framework in which that kind of stuff, and it's great and it still makes sense. I think that this kind of work now, in technologically mediated way, you have people's kind of second order interpretations of that stuff that are actually feeding what they decide to represent and how they decide to represent it. And I think the conditions of language standardization are, you know, an important ingredient of that. I don't know if this is going, but I mean, just picking up on your, you know, like what's data? What's the real data is a very, very interesting.
You just referred to the fact that you look for the norms. The interesting thing is that Dutch dialectologists looking for what a dialect had been went to the United States to find the immigrants who went there in the 17th century to see how Dutch sounded when they were 100 years ago in Holland. So mobility and let's say being a norm, non-mobile, is also an interesting combination. And in terms of the internet, online data, you could also have a historical dimension. You could go back not that far, but you could see what developments we have in terms of different changing or different sounding accents or so.
So basically, we are morms, mobile, older, and so on and so on. Okay, guys.
There's a dialectology that says that women keep the dialect. Because they are not normal.
Right. Okay, firm promise. I mean, this is not going to be the last time we have a discussion on this. And in the meantime, let's give Rob another huge round of applause for the magnificent input we got from him. Thank you.